Our opening thought this morning comes from Mark Miller, who is a United Methodist composer, one of the most prolific composers within United Methodism. And he wrote the song, "Draw the Circle Wide." So this is from that song, "Draw the Circle Wide." Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone. Standing side by side, draw the circle wide. Our next reading comes from Desmond Tutu, and he said these words at the launch of the Free and Equal campaign in Cape Town, South Africa. Desmond Tutu said, "I would refuse to go to a homophobic heaven. No, I would say sorry. I would much rather go to the other place. I would not worship a God who is homophobic, and that is how deeply I feel about this. I am as passionate about this campaign as I ever was about apartheid. For me, it is at the same level." Our next reading comes from the Reconciling Ministries Network, from the United Methodist Queer Collective Collaborates in Pursuit of Progress. This is a press release from just a few weeks ago. The General Conference of the United Methodist Church, otherwise known as the UMC, has eliminated anti-LGBTQ+ legislation from its Book of Discipline, effectively ending 52 years of institutionally sanctioned discrimination. The global body of 862 voting delegates, about 740 who were seated, has spent almost 2 weeks in unusual civility, removing prohibitions against same-sex marriages, ordination of LGBTQ+ clergy, bans against funding education about LGBTQ+ affirmation, and the belief that, quote, "the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching," end quote. It became apparent to me while we were singing that song that I'm going to have trouble holding it together today. So I need you to kind of lift me up and carry me on as we do this together. You're going to indulge me as I celebrate with you something that's taken decades to happen within my own denomination of the United Methodist Church. The Unitarian Universalist Association has been a witness to diversity, equity, and inclusion for many decades. It's provided a model for how other religious communities can draw the circle of beloved community wider still. And I'm especially happy to report to you about the strides that the United Methodist Church has made over the past month at its General Conference. And I wanted to share this with you, my UU siblings, because you have played a part in this process to draw the circle wide within your own congregations, and that has been a model for other religious communities as well. I want to begin by saying that I want to think about the LGBTQ2S+ siblings and allies that made the last month possible at General Conference of the United Methodist Church, especially those who are no longer United Methodists because of the harm that the United Methodist Church caused them. I want them to know they are not forgotten, and each and every one of them deserves reparations for the harm that they experienced. The United Methodist Church should have made it to this day decades ago, but today is finally a new day. Not a completely perfect day, but a new day. Want to go back to 1972 to give you a little bit of history. I'm going to go back farther than 1972, but in 1972 is when the words, quote, "the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching," end quote, were added to the social principles of the United Methodist Church by the 1972 General Conference. More and more restrictions were added in the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church from 1972 all the way until 2019. Ordination bans, bans on same-gender weddings, bans on funding for any LGBTQ plus causes, trials, defrocking, loss of livelihood, and more took place between 1972 and 2019. I'd like to say thank goodness for the United Church of Christ, because that is a place where many of my United Methodist siblings found a home when they could no longer stay in the United Methodist Church. So a little bit of history about Methodism and how we got to this point where from 1972 to 2019, we had this very exclusive and restrictive and punitive stance in relation to persons who are LGBTQ+. It doesn't necessarily go all the way back to John Wesley, but to understand Methodism, you have to go back to John Wesley, who lived from 1703 to 1791, and he created a renewal movement within the Church of England, which he never planned on becoming a new church or a new denomination. He wanted it to be a renewal movement within the Church of England, and he himself died an Anglican priest. He never left the Church of England, and he's well known for a few things. He believed that the world was his parish. He didn't believe that he should be limited by the area that was assigned to him as an Anglican priest. He also believed in grace, and he believed in prevenient grace. He believed that God's grace was there for all from the very beginning. And guess what? At times he talked about that grace being irresistible. And if you come to the logical conclusion that if God's grace is irresistible, perhaps John Wesley was a Universalist. There's a lot of theologians that make that argument. Well, guess what? John Wesley did spend a little bit of time in the colonies of America. Wasn't very successful. We won't go into that. Also, don't want to go to John Wesley if you want to have a model for love life or marriage or anything like that. Okay, let's set that aside. But in 1784, he made an interesting decision. He looked at the Methodist movement in what was now the United States, and he came to the conclusion that the Church of England didn't have a bright future in this new country, so he decided to form a new church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, in 1784. And then, a number of decades after his death, that Methodist Episcopal Church had its first split, which I think is connected to the struggles that we've had in the Methodist movement up to this very day. In 1848, the Methodist Episcopal Church split into two. You have the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. The Methodist Episcopal Church South supported slavery. The Methodist Episcopal Church did not. The Methodist Church was not reunited until 1939. In 1939, and then I wonder if it maybe reunited too quickly, to tell you the truth. But it did reunite in 1939. The Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South became the Methodist Church in 1939. And then it wasn't until 1956 that the Methodist Church did something kind of new and progressive for Christian denominations at that time. The ordination of women happened in 1956. There was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of debate in 1956. Georgia Harkness, one of my theological heroines, was one of the persons who led the debate for the ordination of women. She's a graduate of Boston University, by the way. She led the debate for the ordination of women in the Methodist Church, and it passed in 1956, though there was a great resistance and very, very slow implementation. And it took decades for women to start getting the clergy positions that were anywhere near equivalent to their male colleagues, and for many decades, many churches resisted having women being appointed to them. 11 years later, right before the United Methodist Church was formed, 11 years later, there was a movement, a conservative movement, and a conservative organization that was created in the Methodist Church called the quote, and I say quote for sure here, the quote, good news, end quote, movement. The conservatives in the Methodist Church have been very clever about usurping language that ought to be for very positive purposes, using them for their own. And so the good news movement was this very concerted effort to keep the Methodist Church as conservative as possible, to uphold standards of doctrinal purity, to make the Scripture be the primary, almost infallible source of revelation within the Methodist Church. And so in 1967, the Good News movement forms. And then 1 year later, the United Methodist Church forms. And the United Methodist Church in 1968, when it formed, was a merger of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church. Okay? 1968. Okay? And then in 1972, the new social principles of the United Methodist Church were created. A lot of very good persons were a part of that process. One of my former professors, Walter Mulder, who was a Boston personalist, very progressive United Methodist, was a part of that process. But in that process, the conservatives were able to include in the 1972 social principles that language, the words, quote, the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, end quote. And ever since that was included in the social principles, more restrictive and more punitive language was added through the decades. It's not, I think, surprising that during the 1970s, you also see the formation of a number of conservative think tanks that focused on politics and also focused on religion. You have the Heritage Foundation, which was formed in 1973. By the way, right before 1972, you had the Powell Memo of 1971, which was a blueprint for how the conservative movement could work with institutions of higher education, religious institutions, economic institutions, and political processes to protect the American way of life, as it was often put at that time. So 1973, the Heritage Foundation. 1974, the Cato Institute is formed. And then in 1980, a very interesting thing happened. I joined the United Methodist Church at the age of 13 because they had a very nice big youth group that also had a basketball team. And I wanted to play on a church youth basketball team. So at age 13, I became a United Methodist. And then in 1981, 1 year after I became a United Methodist, the Institute on Religion and Democracy was formed, IRD, which was funded by extremely conservative groups and was an institute that basically focused on trying to move all of the mainline Christian denominations that had some semblance of being progressive more towards the conservative side of things. And they spent millions of dollars attempting to do that, and they spent a lot of time focusing on the United Methodist Church, because the United Methodist Church was the largest, quote, mainline denomination and was considered a big tent denomination and included a wide range of persons on the political spectrum. So they spent much time and much money attacking the progressive wing of the United Methodist Church and trying to promote conservative causes within the United Methodist Church. In 1984, Reconciling Ministries Network was formed under a different name at the time, focusing on reconciling congregations. That was a movement to support United Methodist congregations and persons who wanted to be inclusive, who wanted to include persons who are LGBTQ plus in the full ministry and the full life of the United Methodist Church. I've been connected with Reconciling Ministries Network for many decades. Then another interesting thing happened in 1984 to 1988. I went to college. I went to college at Oklahoma City University. And when I was in college at OCU, I saw my LGBTQ plus friends harmed by the increasing anti-LGBTQ plus positions of the United Methodist Church, especially as it weakened our response to the AIDS crisis. I'll never forget my first semester of my freshman year. At the end of the semester, the dean of students called all of the male students together in the sanctuary of the chapel. Apparently, right after that, he pulled in all the women students and said the same thing to them. But he pulled us all together that one night in the chapel at the end of the fall semester and said, "There have been reports that there is homosexual activity on this campus, and we will not tolerate it." 1984, fall of 1984. Sometime during this next year, we will have our first same-gender wedding in that very same chapel. I hope that dean of students, is looking down upon that, and maybe we'll embrace it now. Or not. Then in 1980, not that long ago, right? 1987, the conservatives put out, they love to put out declarations. They love to form new organizations. They had the Houston Declaration in 1987, holding fast to doctrinal purity and also having a strong stance against, quote, homosexuality, unquote. Then the 1992 Memphis Declaration was pretty much the same thing as the Houston Declaration, just another time to make another declaration. And then guess what happened in 1992? My ordination as a deacon in the United Methodist Church. And then in 1994, another new movement, pretty much the Good News movement, but they had to create another new movement called the Confessing Movement, which I think they called it the Confessing Movement just to dig at us progressives because, we like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church and Confessing Movement within Germany and its resistance to the Nazis. But in 1994, they created the Confessing Movement. And that movement, along with the Good News movement, along with the Institute on Religion and Democracy, continue to try to push for more restrictions, more punishments for persons who are LGBTQ plus or who were their allies within the United Methodist Church. In 1995, I was one of only 7 United Methodist ministers in all of Oklahoma to publicly sign a document called In All Things Charity, which called for the full inclusion of all persons within the United Methodist Church, which called for openness at that time to union services because marriage wasn't legally possible at that time. And I think I may be the only one of those 7 who is left currently serving in the Oklahoma Conference of the United Methodist Church. There's some who are still alive, who are serving in other areas, but I may be the only one left in Oklahoma. But the news gets better. In 1998, I was ordained as an elder in the United Methodist Church, and I was questioned in my ordination interview about my support for LGBTQ plus rights, and I was asked if I was gay by a member of the committee. I was getting married a few months later to Kristen, but they felt like they had to ask me that question because by that time in the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church, quote, self-avowed practicing homosexuals, end quote, could not be ordained in the United Methodist Church. So they asked apparently every person coming up for ordination that question. Then from 2001 to 2015, I was first dean of the Wimberley School of Religion at Oklahoma City University until 2009, and then until 2015, I was dean of the Petrie College of Arts and Sciences. And during that time, I watched dozens of students leave the United Methodist Church because of its exclusion of persons who are LGBTQ+. And I saw many persons who were called to ministry feel like they could not in integrity stay in the United Methodist Church, and so they left, many of them going to the United Church of Christ. I also had to deal with trustees and United Methodist Church leaders who wanted to impose anti-LGBTQ+ policies on campus. I was encouraged to stop speaking out about marriage equality. I was encouraged to not put posts on Facebook about these controversial topics because of the negative impact it could have on the university-church relationship. I was also encouraged by one trustee of the university to make sure that LGBTQ+ students were not receiving United Methodist scholarships. Because the conservatives have put in the Book of Discipline that no causes related that were supportive of LGBTQ+ persons could be funded by the United Methodist Church. And so this trustee interpreted that as meaning no United Methodist related scholarship could go to a student who was LGBTQ+. I was even told that my public stance on LGBTQ+ rights and marriage equality was hampering the efforts to raise money for new chemistry labs at the university. You would have had the money for those chemistry labs if you would just not talk about marriage equality, I was told. Shortly thereafter, I decided being a dean at the university was not something I wanted to continue to do and decided to go back to full-time teaching on my own accord and decision. Now, in 2014, though, things began to get interesting in the United Methodist Church and also in Oklahoma. Remember, there were 7 ministers that signed the document in 1995. In 2014, 125 plus ministers in Oklahoma publicly signed on in support of full LGBTQ plus inclusion and marriage equality. And dozens were former students of Oklahoma City University. Then, somewhere around that time, I've repressed the actual year, the Wesleyan Covenant Association was formed. That's just another version of the Good News Movement and the Confessing Movement, NIRD. So the Wesleyan Covenant Association, whose mission was to help, is now to help United Methodist congregations and United Methodists leave the United Methodist Church to become members of the Global Methodist Church, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. In 2016, at the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, there was an erosion of support for reproductive rights. For years, the United Methodist Church had supported reproductive rights and access to reproductive health care, and that was eroded in 2016. Then right after the General Conference in 2016, a good friend of mine, Karen Oliveto, became the first openly lesbian bishop elected to the United Methodist Church in the Western jurisdiction. And the conservatives went crazy. And in 2019, there was a specially called General Conference to finally determine where the United Methodist Church would go. This was the whole focus of this conference, on matters related to human sexuality. That was the kind of euphemistic language used. We're going to talk about where the United Methodist Church is on matters related to human sexuality, when it really was a vote on whether we were going to include persons who were LGBTQ plus or not. And in 2019, we voted not to include persons who were LGBTQ plus. We voted about 55% to 45% in favor of the traditional plan, as it was called. And the traditional plan brought about even more restrictive and punitive measures on persons who were LGBTQ plus in ministry and anyone who sought to be their ally or to officiate in same-gender marriages. That happened in 2019. But then something pretty amazing happened. The resistance formed. In 2019, the legislation in 2019 was so restrictive and so punitive that a lot of people woke up and said, where are we going with this? What is the end game here? And the progressives actually organized enthusiastically, probably organized the best they had ever done in my history as United Methodist, and they won most of the elections for the 2020 General Conference. So it became clear to the conservatives in the United Methodist Church that 2020 was not going to be the same as 2019. And so instead of, well, then something kind of helped us out a little bit, and this is the only thing that COVID helped with, but COVID postponed the 2020 conference. And COVID, and the 2020 conference was scheduled for 2022. And then it was postponed again. And we just held it in April to beginning of May 2024. And during that time, between 2020 and 2024, the conservatives realized they were not going to be able to control the future of the United Methodist Church in the way that they wanted, so they left. They left. They disaffiliated. We call it the 2022 to 2023 season of disaffiliation. 25% of U.S. churches left the United Methodist Church in the United States. And in 2024, and those persons who officially left could no longer be delegates at General Conference. So alternates became delegates. New elections for some delegate places had to be held. And in 2024, the United Methodist Church removed all anti-LGBTQ2S+ language from its governing documents. It now defines marriage as being between two consenting adults. It reversed ordination bans for persons who are, quote, self-avowed practicing homosexuals, end quote. Strangest formulation ever. And created, and this is, I think, very important, created a process for reinstatement of ministers who lost their ordination owing to the previous restrictions. Not everything is perfect. There are things that we still have to work on in terms of full inclusion. There's still going to be, right now, a situation where church by church, the trustees can vote whether they will allow for same-gender weddings to happen on church property. That's going to probably be something to come up at the next General Conference. But then, the other thing that happened at this General Conference is that we revised those 1972 social principles. And all of the anti-gay language of the 1972 social principles is out, and a new day is in. And I was very happy about that because I was involved in the revision process of those social principles. And the section that I led, the community of all creation, passed with like 94% of the votes. So very happy about that. The divide in the United Methodist Church, though, has never been just about LGBTQ plus rights. Perhaps more than anything, it's been a political battle between those who are clinging to white patriarchy and Christian nationalism and the capitalistic and militaristic modes of maintaining white supremacy. What Jim Wallace calls, in a book by the same name, he just wrote this book, definitely recommend this book, Jim Wallace calls it the false white gospel. So it's a battle between that focus and those who are seeking justice for the most vulnerable in our communities. It's a battle that has played out many times before in the history of Methodism, over the evils of slavery, over segregation, over the role of women in the church, and most recently, over LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion. Now we are seeing new battle lines drawn over issues of doctrinal purity. If you don't believe certain things, if you don't adhere fully to the Nicene Creed, that's a problem. That's what some people are trying to kind of lift up as the new battleground. If you don't believe, certain doctrines literally, then you can't be a minister within the United Methodist Church. That's another line of battle that's coming up. And then also we're going to have a battle about the United Methodist Church's money and how we invest it. Especially how we invested in relation to climate justice and environmental justice. The entities that control our money don't want to give up investing in fossil fuel companies. They want to have a seat at the table, they say. They want to be engaged in helping these fossil fuel companies to become better and more socially and ecologically responsible entities. Right. The battle we're seeing is more about the role of religion in society than it is about anything else. Will religion primarily be used to protect the power and profits of the privileged, even if that means embracing autocracy? Or will religion be a force for social justice, the liberation of the oppressed, and justice for the community of all life on earth? This battle will continue. And in many ways, it's a battle for the soul of our communities, and whether we will develop into a vibrant, multicultural democracy or succumb to white Christian nationalism and its embrace of authoritarian autocracy. I think it's that stark. I think it is that stark. Today, though, I'm going to celebrate. As I celebrate the recent positive changes in the United Methodist Church, I also want to thank you. I want to thank you and all of my other UU siblings who have been a consistent witness for LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion during the whole time that we as United Methodists have been experiencing our struggle for inclusion. I want to thank the First Unitarian Church in Oklahoma City, where I've heard my first Unitarian Universalist minister give a sermon, and it was very thought-provoking. I was in college. This was very thought-provoking, and I really loved what he was saying, even though I didn't understand all of it at the time because I had not read William James yet, and he loved William James. I want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Church of Lawton, where my parents have been members for decades. My dad and mom started the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Lawton in my dad's office, where he was a psychiatrist in Lawton, and they were charter members of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Lawton, and I got to be a part of that and see that, and was invited to speak there and very much included within that community over the years. I want to thank Harvard Unitarian Universalist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I attended for a year when I was a PhD student at Boston University and really was questioning whether I should stay in the United Methodist Church. I want to thank them for the home that they provided and for the model of inclusivity that they showed as well. Bartlesville Unitarian Universalist congregation, where I spoke a number of times, but most importantly, I want to thank Red River UU for being my second spiritual home, in many ways, my main spiritual home over the past number of years, and inviting me to speak when almost no United Methodist Church in Oklahoma would. It's been a beautiful time to be with you over the past number of years. All of my UU siblings have contributed to drawing the circle wide for our LGBTQ plus siblings, and I promise you that your witness played a role. Your witness had a positive effect on what just happened in the United Methodist Church, and it's because of your witness for love, justice, and inclusion that this United Methodist minister will be forever thankful to my UU siblings, regardless of what happens in my own denomination in the future. I will always consider myself fully at home in the Unitarian Universalist Church. Our parting thought comes from Tammy Baldwin in her March on Washington speech. She said, "There will not be a magic day when we wake up and it's now okay to express ourselves publicly. We make that day by doing things publicly, first in small numbers, then in greater numbers, until it's simply the way things are and no one thinks twice."